Welcome to Narrative Responsibility, a podcast about examining the meta story of your life, how well it is serving you, and how to change it for the better. I'm Elena Wolf, relationship coach and life alignment mentor, and this is this week's New Perspective. Hi there! I'm so glad you're here today. This is episode 34. Breaking the Habit of Comfort Eating. If you didn't catch episode 33 on comfort eating, it's the background for today's topic, though I don't think you have to have listened to it in order to follow along with this, because today is story time plus practical action steps. Last time was getting a working definition of what comfort eating or emotional eating is and why we do it, why it works, and then how it can impact us in the long term in negative ways, which is why maybe we want to break that habit if we're doing it. Today, I'm going to talk about the 3 phases of management and recovery for this type of disordered eating as I see them and as I guess I experienced them. These essentially are finding better ways to resolve the immediate need, proactively managing immediate needs, and then preventing distressing levels of immediate need from arising in the first place. But before we get into those action steps, I want to share my journey of awareness around emotional eating, because I think it will be really helpful for kind of cueing you on what to look for in your own life if this is a coping mechanism that you use, and especially if it's one that you are thinking you want to change. I don't remember exactly when I started comfort eating, but it was probably when I was upper childhood, like 4th or 5th grade. I know that when I was in 8th or 9th grade, so like 14-ish years old, I got very obsessive about what I ate and managed a pretty strict eating schedule. I don't know if I would go so far as to say that it was truly disordered eating. It was more just I paid very close attention to my macros. I was pretty controlling with not having more than a certain amount of carbs, and certainly like controlled my sugar intake very strongly. Then there were also times when that would get thrown completely out the window because I got a little bit stressed out. Maybe it's, project season at school or something like that. And so that healthy regime of really being mindful about what I ate and paying attention to food as fuel and keeping it in balance was always the first thing to go when my stress went beyond my capacity to contain it. And then when the stress level would decrease, I would sometimes end up in a really restrictive diet where I was specifically trying to lose weight that I had put on while I was stress eating and comfort eating. And so I got caught in that swing back and forth between having phases of maintenance that were pretty healthy or indulgence that were unhealthy, and then severe restriction. I know that by the time I was in my 20s, my metabolism was messed up. I also think there was probably a hormonal component to that because of being on birth control. And then when I went off of birth control, my system really didn't reset properly until after I had had a child. But all through my 20s, I had that same kind of swing back and forth that I'd had in high school. And often it was longer periods in the stressed out, overeating, comfort eating, eating the wrong kinds of things mode. I could recognize on a conscious level that I was not eating in the way that had always felt right to my body and that had always felt good. but I didn't know what to do about it because just the lifestyle that I had with the hours that I worked and working a desk job and having a culture around me of a lot of eating out and indulgence, and it just didn't, I don't know, I really just couldn't manage it in a healthy way. And there was probably also some undiagnosed ADHD happening with sensory stimulation, either too much that I was trying to escape from or not enough, and getting bored and using food as a strategy for distracting from boredom. You know, lots of issues. Well, fast forward to when I was about 6 months postpartum and I was breastfeeding, and I had the thought, aren't you supposed to like lose weight really easily when you're breastfeeding? I'm not. What's going on? And I decided to do a food audit. What I discovered is that on not just a daily basis, but sometimes a multiple times a day basis, I was hitting a point at work where I felt too stressed to handle the situation, and I was just reaching for a snack, something sweet usually, but sometimes something like chips, and it was a huge wake-up call that something is really unbalanced in my life. If that's because I had thought that maybe that was happening a couple times a week. No, it was daily, and sometimes like a couple times a day, every week. So I thought, okay, I need to knock this off, and found that within 2 days of not letting myself have that outlet of comfort eating when I got distressed, that I was having like breakdowns where I would have to go to the bathroom and cry at work because my stress load was too high. I could not handle it. And I realized that I did not have hardly any coping mechanisms besides eating something to try and feel better. About the only one that I had was listening to music, like really loudly in headphones, to try and drown out some of the noise around me. This was also around the time that things fell apart in my marriage to my son's father. And I discovered kind of by accident that being active is a way to mitigate stress. Because when I wanted to not be in the house, I would just put my son in the stroller and we'd go walk around the neighborhood. And sometimes we would take like a 2-hour walk, and that seemed to calm me down. What a shock. Being active helps you calm down, like they say. I hate it as much as everyone, but sometimes the simple advice is in fact accurate. So flash forward 3 years, and I'm divorced, back in my hometown, and struggling to stay emotionally calm, regulated, centered, whatever you want to call it, with a very young child. So I kind of had to do a crash course in things like meditation and nervous system regulation, boundaries, just for the sake of not blowing up at a child that was too young to understand why mommy was in distress. And I've found that if I could stay out ahead of my distress, then I could eat well, I could stay regulated, I could be the mom that I wanted to be. But there were still a lot of times, like maybe once a week at this point, where I couldn't, where something just pushed me too far. And I was still using comfort eating to regulate at that point. I figured it was a choice between being a mom who yelled at her kid or a mom who stuffed her feelings with a cookie. And frankly, the cookies are only hurting me. So that was the choice that I made. And it really just kind of felt like, well, every time I do a line of Oreos, I'm just going to have to extend my diet for a month if I ever want to get back to the body shape that I want. Okay, that sucks, but it's better than yelling at my kid. So at this point, I had an awareness of what was going on and an awareness that it was something to be managed about myself, but I still didn't really have a good way to self-soothe once I hit that kind of moment of overwhelm where I'm past my capacity to cope with this in a rational, adult, measured sort of way. But at least having that awareness of these patterns gave me the space to kind of observe this chain of cause and effect, and, to be able to spot the rising distress sooner and sooner and sooner in that process, so that I wasn't getting all the way to distress level very often. And then the times that it did still happen and I reached for something like cookies or ice cream to soothe it with, I was actually able to notice what happened in my body as a result, because I wasn't having like this constant drip of sugar and simple carbohydrates anymore. So I could actually feel like, oh gosh, it's an hour later and my body is kind of nauseous and feeling ill. Or, I could notice that later that day, I would be more likely to make an impulsive and poorly considered choice for what to have for dinner if I had stuffed my feelings with cookies that afternoon. I could notice how the next day, after both of those happened, that I'd feel kind of lethargic and irritable, low energy, and just kind of gross, in my body. Things just didn't feel quite right. And I could notice that if I had reached for the cookies and had a bad meal the night before, I was a lot more likely to reach for the cookies and have a bad meal the next night. And I could see how if I gave in on that second day, then it would lead to a third day and fourth and like a whole week. And then suddenly I would be back in this pattern of comfort eating on a very regular basis. And then something would magically snap me out of it and I could go back to my normal eating patterns. I noticed that if I had something sweet when I was in a very calm state, on the other hand, like if I was not in emotional distress, if I was not in a sort of a nervous system activation stress state, then I could have like 1 or 2 cookies and feel totally satisfied. I could have a small scoop of ice cream and be fine and think that was a nice little treat. But if I was in distress, if I was in that state of nervous system activation, if I ate anything like that, I would just want more and more. So I could see, a difference between how it felt to experience that kind of food when I was regulated or not, or maybe we want to call it like centered versus distressed. I noticed that if I had sweets on an empty stomach, I would get an intense craving for more, but if I had them after a meal, I didn't. I noticed that if I started my day with something sweet or bready, like muffins or pancakes, then I was a lot more likely to want cookies or, something sweet in the afternoon, or dessert after dinner, or maybe both. So all of these subtle links between what I ate and when I ate it and what I ate it in relationship to became visible once I was mostly regulated, by which I mean I wasn't in daily emotional distress anymore, and mostly eating a healthier diet, by which I mean primarily home-cooked food, not a lot of processed foods, lots of fruits and vegetables and meats, and some starchy carbs, but not a huge portion of my diet going to things like rice and potatoes and pasta. So it was at this point that I could actually see the impacts of the exceptions when I would have like a high load of sugar or processed carbs, precisely because they were exceptions at that point rather than my norm. And because I had been cultivating this awareness of my body and how I managed it and my emotional distress levels and my nervous system activations, like I'd been looking at this stuff for years at this point. And so I had a body of information that I could compare to. Because sometimes it takes a while to get all of the data points for the patterns to become clear. And sometimes you have to try and fail and try and fail and try and fail and fail in so many different ways to start actually identifying the common denominators or the links between them, right? It was definitely post-pandemic, maybe like 2021, 2022, that I finally started like clicking these patterns into place. And it was also after I read at least the first couple of the 3 books I mentioned last time. So I started trying to give up cookies back in January of 2015. That's what, like 6 or 7 years to figure this out? That's what I mean when that's what I meant last time when I said that it took me a lot of fumbling around to kind of get to all of these realizations. And again, reading particular books also gave me certain patterns to look for because they were talking about the impact of sugar and carbohydrates on an empty stomach, on your system in terms of inflammation and like energy and how it makes you feel. The first of the 3 books that I read was Dr. Susan Cooper's book, Metabolic Storm. And I read that back in 2020 because one of my very first coaching clients was reading it and wanted me to understand the protocols she was living by and the reasons why. And then I read Dr. Julia Ross's book, The Diet Cure, in, I don't know, maybe late 2021. That was a recommendation from a friend who was reading it. And that book really emphasized protein and the importance of neurotransmitters. And so it kind of gave me a good tool for snapping out of a sugar spiral if I fell into one. And also kind of explained why the times that I had mysteriously snapped out of it seemed to correlate to things like steak and spinach salad night and basically just a time when I overloaded on protein, detoxed from carbs, and then magically felt great, the next day. It's not that magic. There's a science to it. And then I think I found the Glucose Goddess Instagram account and her book, Glucose Revolution, maybe about a year ago as I'm recording this. So like summer of 2023. And I have been back and forth using her protocols, not using her protocols enough over the past year to be sure that I like her protocols and I don't really want to go off of them ever again. I just feel better when I follow that particular set of patterns with, again, how and what I eat. So at this point, I think I'm 9.5 years past that first real awareness that something was severely out of balance in my life and in terms of how I managed my body and its stress levels and my emotional centering. And, I can say at this point that the handful of times in a year that I choose to comfort eat, it is fully intentional and because I believe it is the best tool for the job. Or maybe it's a tool that I'm deliberately combining with other tools, but something that I feel is genuinely adding to the alleviation of stress without causing a lot of harm. I've definitely tested the tool enough to see both its benefits and its drawbacks. And I've done a lot of work to identify the needs that are always underneath the times I need to use that tool. And for the most part, I find other ways to meet those needs rather than using this tool. This is what having a good toolbox of coping mechanisms and skills is for. It's so that you can be fully deliberate with your choices and you can say, okay, I have 20 different tools that I could use. Which one is actually the right one for this task? Because the thing about habits and coping mechanisms is this. They are solving a genuine need for us. If that need remains unsolved, then we're going to have a really hard time letting go of a coping mechanism that we are still getting use out of. So we're going to be better served by finding other coping mechanisms that work just as well, and then ultimately by resolving the underlying need. Because if we can do that, then all that we're kind of left with is a behavior pattern that doesn't have emotional need behind it. So it's a lot easier to break. Whereas if there's still an unmet emotional need driving the behavior, then we're going to be fighting with ourselves the whole time that we're trying to break that habit. And we're going to always be at risk of a relapse, of falling back into that habit the second we take our attention and our focus off of managing that need and denying the habit that we know will satisfy that need. I mean, it's literally the same as any other addiction. If you can't solve for the underlying need, then you're going to always be at risk of a relapse. Which is why my strategy for letting go of comfort eating has the phases it does. I mean, they kind of mirror the phases that I went through. And again, the phases are first finding better ways to cope with the immediate need, those times of emotional distress or physical, like nervous system activation that you can't get out of any other way. And then proactively managing times of immediate need, and finally preventing immediate need from reaching the point of distress in the first place. Another way to talk about these phases might be comfort eating in a less damaging way, and then finding other self-soothing tools and learning how to spot distress when it is forming in order to ease it sooner. And finally, changing the underlying stressors in your life to prevent accumulating so much stress that it becomes distress. So let's talk about each of these phases and what you might do differently or try, and why I'm suggesting these things. Let's start with a quick callback to our macro level strategies from last time about what comfort eating is seeking to do, because there's 3 of them. The first is adding a ballast of good to something that feels bad to kind of balance out the bad. The second is converting something that feels bad to something that feels good, or at least neutral. And the third is covering up that state of being that feels bad with a bunch of good, or at least a bunch of neutral things. That third is really a pretty unhealthy self-management strategy, so I'm going to not talk about that one. I'm just going to include strategies for the first 2, because I think those are better principles for actually managing ourselves. All right. What do we do in phase 1 when we are trying to solve times of immediate need and distress in a better way? Basically, how do we comfort eat better? When we're trying to cope with a really big immediate need, basically we're looking for relief from distress. We're trying to soothe ourselves. We're trying to soothe our body. We're trying to soothe our emotions, or we're trying to distract ourselves from them. So what can we do that's going to soothe the distress, but without making it worse in a near future sense, like without eating something that's going to cause us to feel sick an hour from now, or disrupt our eating pattern for the rest of the day, or flow on into the next day's energy, and without causing long-term harm or contributing to long-term harm? And this is things like weight gain, metabolic disruption, insulin resistance because of frequent glucose spikes, that kind of thing. So my answer, if you've been comfort eating, is to substitute better food choices when you comfort eat. You kind of have 2 options here. The first is to choose different foods, and the second is to choose different eating patterns. So food choice swaps are going to work if the need that you have is really for like a sense of nurturance, or maybe you're actually hungry and you need to attend to that biological need, or maybe you're feeling bored and understimulated, maybe a little anxious because of that, and you're really just looking for something to engage you in a sensory way to kind of bring you back to the here and now and the present moment. But you're not necessarily picky about what that stimulation is or what the type of food is. So in a case like this, find something that you find delicious and stimulating and enjoyable, but that's also healthy. For me, one of the best one of the best examples, we have a restaurant here in town that has the best charred Brussels sprouts with bacon. And maybe that's not your thing. It's fine if it's not, but I find them incredibly delicious. Like, it's a treat to go get that. And it's easy for me to get to. It provides a very healthy, it's vegetables and a little bit of meat, option that's very sensory rich. It's stimulating. It feels like a treat. It feels indulgent, but it's not actually causing harm. It's not going to give me a big glucose spike and a crash. It's not going to make me feel sick later. It's a good choice. Another might look like, instead of making mac and cheese for comfort food, you make a variety of, say, Indian vegetables. And again, they're going to be warm. They're going to have a lot of spice and flavor and deliciousness, but not be super carb heavy, not be super fat heavy. And that's another way that you can still get the need for sensory enrichment and something that feels like really delicious and soothing and like you're happy to be eating it, but there's not a negative consequence to your body as a result of it. Another option might be finding a non-sweet kind of drink that you like, whether this is a special tea or maybe something like hot chocolate that doesn't have any added sugar. That's actually really hard to find on the shelf. So my recommendation is just to make your own. Get some cocoa, like unsweetened cocoa powder, and then you can doll it up with like cinnamon, vanilla, maybe some heavy cream to make it really like indulgent. It's going to taste like a dessert, but without the sugar. And you're not trying to fake sweeten it or anything like that. Just like get used to actually just tasting the chocolate. It can be so soothing and so wonderful. But again, it's not wrecking anything because it's not loaded with like 10 grams of sugar, which is like half your daily recommendation in one drink. It's ridiculous. But if there are times that you need it to be a specific food because that recipe and the associations that you have with it are what bring you the comfort as much as the food itself, then find a way to eat it more strategically. So, for example, if it's something that's a dessert or a sweet thing, have it as a dessert. Tell yourself, okay, I'm going to have my favorite chocolate cake, but I'm going to have it after I eat this healthy meal. And then eat a really healthy meal that's like vegetable and protein forward, and have your cake afterward. That's going to mitigate the glucose spike, and you're going to have given your body good fuel. You've given it what it actually needs for fuel and rebuilding, and then you have the comfort of the indulgence afterward. If it's something like mac and cheese, then maybe you have a vegetable first, and maybe consider doing some portion control so that you're not overeating, or make sure that you're eating really mindfully. So both that you're fully savoring the meal, this meal that is your special comfort thing, but also so you have a chance to hear your body when it sends its satiety cues, rather than just like eating the entire plate as fast as you can and then going back for seconds and then ending up really overfull and just feeling gross. And if you want some more kind of strategic eating, I do highly recommend the Glucose Revolution. She makes good points and kind of lays out the science for what's going on and why you want to do it this way. But, the reason to do this strategic eating is that you're not denying yourself the comfort of your favorite thing. You're not telling yourself you can't have it or anything like that. You're saying, okay, we're going to do this and we're going to find a way to make it less harmful so that we're not eating too much of it and we're not making ourselves feel sick afterward, and we're not denying our body fuel because we fed it with these empty calories. No, we're going to give ourselves what we need on a physiological level, and then we can give ourselves what we need on an emotional level. So you're still indulging, you're just kind of changing the context around it so that you're in control as opposed to being controlled by this impulse. So these swaps are all things that I have done and I find to be immensely helpful. It's a way to acknowledge the need for immediate emotional relief when you have hit your threshold and you just cannot. But it's balancing it with the other needs of your body and your life and the whole system of you, both kind of short-term needs and long-term needs. And I think it's also a good idea to have these kind of food swaps or eating strategies in your back pocket if you do have a culture, a family, a friend group that does a lot of indulgent eating or comfort eating, and that's just kind of part of the culture around you, so that you don't have to feel cut off from your culture, you don't have to police your friends or anything like that. You can engage with that activity in a way that feels healthier for you. So what about phase 2, when we get to more proactively managing our times of immediate need? The first thing is that we work on phase 2 stuff when we are not in immediate need. Phase 1 is just changing our technique. It's using the same tool in a different way. But phase 2 is about learning new tools and employing those tools in a different way than simply getting relief in the immediate moment. There's both the aspect of noticing our rising distress levels and then also separately having more tools to respond to it than just stuffing it behind some carbs. The noticing portion is going to be things like mindfulness, checking in with our bodies regularly, paying attention to our emotional cues, paying attention to our physical cues. And honestly, like, that is its whole own topic. So for today, I'm just going to let the concept be enough. The point is that we want to notice our cues from our body and our emotional body soon enough to be able to choose the tool that we use, rather than getting to our point of being overloaded, overwhelmed, can't choose, and we just get hijacked by the path of least resistance, which is usually going to be comfort eating if we have that pathway established. So the other thing we want to do is to develop new tools for soothing ourselves, skills for managing distress that aren't comfort eating, or what we might think of as other coping mechanisms that can do the same job without the side effects. And the tools here are going to be split into our two underlying goals. Are we trying to add some good to just kind of balance out the bad? Or are we trying to transmute the bad into something good, or at least neutral? Adding good without going to comfort eating is likely going to involve engaging our other senses in a positive way. So instead of adding taste, can you add maybe something that is a nice scent or tactile sensations that bring you joy or comfort or pleasure? If we're talking about scent, maybe it's lighting a candle or putting on a perfume or doing, taking an aromatherapy bath or having some scented oils, that you can put on, that sort of thing. If we're talking tactile pleasures, maybe this is soft textures, or maybe it's heat, like from a heating pad, or putting your hands around a warm cup of herbal tea or something like that. Or maybe it's pressure. Like, I know some people really enjoy the anxiety blankets that are weighted blankets, or having, someone hold them somewhat for being held, but also just for the pressure that another person can put on your body. What about rituals or processes that you find enjoyable or that bring comfort or pleasure? This might be things like listening to music that you love. Maybe meditating can be a process or a practice that brings you comfort. Maybe it's something like taking a bubble bath or working on a puzzle, rewatching a favorite movie, that sort of thing. You might also try seeking contact or connection with a loved one, with a pet, getting out in nature. All of those can be very soothing to our bodies. They can be soothing to emotions that are rising to this level of distress and discomfort. It's really helpful to develop rituals and practices when we're in a calm place so that if we get distressed, we have muscle memory for them. It's important to think of or be aware of different things that bring us comfort and pleasure that we can have right at our fingertips if we get a moment of distress that comes on, so that we're able to remind ourselves, oh, I can do more than just grab a cookie. I can, grab that candle instead, or whatever it is. So basically, we want to have positive associations and muscle memory kind of pre-established in reaching for these things and trying out these other senses or these other processes, so that if we're in a moment of distress or rising distress, that we don't just automatically reach for the comfort eating, that we can reach for other things, that we don't have to think too hard about picking up a different tool because we've established a relationship to those tools already. Transmuting kind of a bad energy or bad feeling into something good or neutral is going to be a more active process. Like if you remember in elementary science, they talk about energy as being either potential or one of the forms of actualized, like potential versus kinetic. So another way to view this is, how do I get into action to change this potential energy or this negative energy into kinetic energy, into positive energy? You could also look at it as trying to change the neurochemical balance in your body with activity, with action. So these processes are going to be a little more co-creative rather than simply doing something that you can receive, that your body can just receive more passively. This is where you're actively doing something to change your state of being. So this might be practices like breath work, which there are many forms of. There's stuff like the Wim Hof breath holding. There's some things like Kundalini breathing. There's very kind of focused, measured breathing. Various patterns and protocols are out there, but some of them have been measured to change your neurochemical balance if you do them for a certain amount of time in certain ways. So aside from it being just a comforting discipline and a good way to tune into your body, you literally can change your neurochemical state with how you change your breath. It's wild. There's also deliberate movement, whether this is taking a walk, going for a run, dancing. Dancing is apparently very good for changing our mood state, or any other kind of movement that feels appealing to you. Basically, the thing here is something that you would actually do. So it's great to say, oh, I'll go roller skating, but if you don't have roller skates, there's too much friction there. You're not actually going to do it. Or, oh, I'll just go for a run, but actually you hate running. There's friction there. You're not going to do it. You can try creating things, making art, writing poetry, playing a musical instrument to try to get your feelings out and externalize them, like literally purge them through the action that you're taking. You can try talking it out with a friend or a loved one. You can put on a playlist that will deliberately match your emotional state and then lead you into a new one. So really, you're just looking for anything that's going to allow the energy of stress or distress to move through you and come out as action, as anything that you can do to change the neurochemical balance in your mind at that time. And finally, part 3, preventing immediate need. phase, phase 3 is going to look a lot like phase 2, except that it's more like maintenance that you do to keep stress levels and emotional distress below your containment threshold, rather than something that you do in response to rising levels of stress or distress. And in phase 3, you're probably going to have a variety of practices that you do regularly, whether that's like daily, weekly, a couple times a week. And those might be things like a combination of movement, meditation, breath work, self-soothing rituals, some combination thereof. And in this phase, you're probably also looking at the underlying needs, like the imbalances in your life that are causing this stress or distress to begin with, and then trying to solve them so that you're solving the problem upstream and kind of preventing that source of stress from even getting to you on a daily basis in the first place. So rather than having to cope with those times of big need, you solve the need before it happens at all. One example of this, and why I'm putting it in phase 3, is finding a new job. Like if you have a job that is really stressful for you, either because of the environment, like the relational environment there, or because the tasks that you're doing are pretty far out of alignment with your personality type and your flow states, it's a good idea to get out of that situation. That's going to be a continual source of stress for you, but also something you probably have to approach mindfully. You want to find the right situation to move to, the right shift to make. It's not something that you should be doing in response to immediate need. It's something that is a long-term change that should be done in a mindful, deliberate way. And that might take months or most of a year even to enact, just depending on what your circumstances are. And so that's kind of end phase stuff. You want to have the ability to deal with the immediate need in a way that doesn't cause harm. And then you want to start managing your emotions and your nervous system activation states more proactively so that you're not hitting that kind of spike of immediate need very often. And then you also want to get to a place where you stay regulated most of the time and can thoughtfully, deliberately make those big changes in order to just kind of solve the root of the problem rather than managing symptoms. And there's just so much more that I can say about how we relate to our bodies and our nervous systems and our emotional selves, but that is going to cover things for today and wrap up this kind of topic of emotional eating, why we do it, why we want to stop doing it, how we can stop doing it. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. And if you want to know more about my work as a coach, you can check out thepatternbreaker.com. You can follow my delicious Instagram at thepatternbreaker. You can join the party at my Patreon, patreon.com/narrative responsibility. And until next time, what part of your story are you going to take responsibility for this week?